They are amongst the greatest treasures known to humankind, revered and feared for centuries. But many of them have a dark history, their creators possessed of madness and misery, their finders and holders struck by illness, death and misfortune. Dare you discover the secrets of these cursed treasures? A curse upon a great historical treasure could come in many forms, but it always comes at a great cost to its creator, finder, or owner. The first stop on our journey to find cursed treasure takes us to the continent of Africa. We are journeying to an area in present-day Nigeria, which was once called the Kingdom of Benin. For 600 years, a culturally rich people called the Edo lived there. But in 1897, their kingdom came to a bloody and violent end, casting a curse that continues to this day.
British troops carried out a vast massacre. Thousands of people were killed, slaughtered.
As the men, women and children of his city lay dead in the streets, the king of Benin fled. His burning kingdom was stormed by the conquering forces, who plundered the hundreds of priceless metal plaques that hung from the palace walls.
These plaques, which are known today as the Benin bronzes, had been created between the 13th and the 16th century, and they told the story of life in the imperial court of Benin.
They were made for cultural reasons, which could either be spiritual, religious, ceremonial, or any other functions that represent the cultural way of life of the people of Benin.
There are a number of different types of Benin bronzes, including the famous bronze plaques and also the heads of the Obas, or kings of the Kingdom of Benin.
It is thought that more than 10,000 pieces of treasure were looted by the invading soldiers. In addition to the plaques, there were carved elephant tusks and ivory leopards. There were also thousands of bracelets called manillas, which, as we discover later, held a dark secret all of their own.
The Benin bronzes have been a festering international sore. They, like the Elgin marbles, are almost the poster child for priceless artifacts looted by the British Empire.
There are old traditions from this area which claim that curses were placed on the looters of these particular bronzes, going back to the early 1800s, and that the curse has never been lifted. If this is the case, there might be some kind of sorcery or magic that was actually placed on the bronzes before they were taken.
The Benin Kingdom was a thriving kingdom, very thriving, very successful, and oral records point out that this kingdom existed from around the 13th century to around the 19th century, when it was eventually collapsed by the British Empire.
The success of the Kingdom of Benin and the Edo people was largely based on trade with countries like Portugal and even Britain. The Edo sold spices, including pepper, but Benin was most renowned for the stunning work of its artisans.
There were particular craftsmen and women who specialized in artworks that were made either of bronze material, brass, or elephant tusk material.
But a special kind of craftsmanship was reserved for items made for the king, who the Edo called the Oba.
The craftsmanship of the bronzes are quite exquisite. They were created with a technique called lost wax casting, and these were some of the most amazing pieces that have ever been discovered. And this goes back potentially to the 13th century. So we're talking about a very long period of time, several hundred years, that they were being produced. They were often produced in honor of the kings and the queens and the queen mothers and so forth, as kind of ritual ancestral pieces honoring the accession to the throne.
Benin was renowned not just for its riches, but also its strength. For many years, it had succeeded in resisting the colonial forces sweeping across the African continent.
In the late 19th century, European powers effectively divided up the continent of Africa. So each European power was allowed to acquire the territory of one particular part.
Britain, Germany, Belgium, France, they sat down and then they partitioned Africa amongst themselves. That set the tone for the scramble of Africa, right? And this is what led to the eventual colonization of Africa.
Benin was one of the few remaining independent kingdoms on the continent, yet conquering it was firmly in the sights of the marauding forces of colonial Europe.
So from 1892, the British had a treaty with the Kingdom of Benin, and there was a feeling by 1897 that the Oba of Benin, the king, was not abiding by the terms of the treaty.
Britain was demanding a monopoly on trade from the kingdom and the region. But Benin's king, or Oba as he was called, refused. He refused to grant this monopoly.
In January 1897, Britain made a move that would lead it to being the imperial power with a prize.
The Benin Kingdom was known to have rich natural resources, raw materials, different kinds of raw materials. Also the land itself, right? Land for mining, land for extracting resources, right, for the empire.
So the British sent in a group of representatives.
This supposedly peaceful but clearly provocative group of trade envoys was attacked on their way to Benin City.
This was a little African kingdom challenging the great might of the great British Empire. So to punish the Oba, Britain sent military forces.
The British military's full-scale operation pretty much destroyed this culture, destroyed the city itself, burn it to the ground, and take lots of the Benin bronzes away with them.
We will never know whether the British suspected the trade envoys would be killed and that this was their plan all along. But what is certain is that Imperial Britain wasted no time in taking the Benin bronzes and the country's huge natural resources for itself.
So what resulted then was not only the fall of the Benin Empire or the Benin Kingdom, but also the appropriation and dislocation of their cultural material.
These beautiful pieces were created not just as a record of life across the centuries in the Kingdom of Benin, but as a manifestation of the soul of the nation itself.
Spokesmen from Britain maintained that they took the Benin bronzes in order to protect them from the looters.
The Kingdom of Benin was then dissolved, and eventually it became part of the Nigeria Protectorate, so part of the British Empire.
But what happened next to the Benin bronzes?
Everything that was taken by the British troops was brought to London. Many of the pieces were then placed by the Foreign Office in the British Museum, where they remain to this day.
The British Museum, after receiving them, put them on display. And the purpose of putting them on display was a demonstration of British imperial might on the walls of the British Museum for everyone to see.
Other pieces were sold off at auction, and they were bought by buyers from around the world, especially from Germany and the United States.
The bronzes, the sacred artifacts that were taken are still on display in not just British museums, but other museums across Europe and around the world.
Demands that the treasures of Benin be sent back to their place of origin have largely gone unheeded by the British Museum. But other British and international institutions have pledged to return the items in their collection taken from Benin. But what of the supposed curse of the Benin bronzes? There are no records of the evil invaders who looted the treasures being damned. But historians made a shocking discovery when they investigated how the bronze plaques of Benin had been made.
So the metal that was used to create the Benin bronzes has controversial origins.
Some of the artifacts come from what was undoubtedly a cursed trade, slavery.
The Benin Kingdom sold many Black Africans to European slave traders who ended up in the New World.
The Oba of Benin had accepted metal bracelets called manila as payment for slaves he'd captured from neighboring African countries. It was these cursed objects that were melted down to make many of the Benin bronze plaques.
Today, the descendants of some of the slaves who live in the United States argue that Nigeria's claim to have the manillas and all the other bronzes returns should be resisted because, so this argument goes, these artifacts are the most visible representations of their own descendants' history.
The way in which the bronzes were taken originally is got quite a dark kind of history associated with it, so it feels right that they should be returned.
I think if we look at all the factors together, including the way in which they were taken through violence, we need to have some sort of sensible solution to the problem today. And that probably means that you have to give people in Nigeria meaningful access to these pieces one way or another.
I support repatriations. It's an acknowledgement of the history of colonial rule and colonial violence. There's so much more that we can do as museums to decolonize our collections through collaborating and bringing communities into the storerooms and allowing them to decide and to determine how they want the objects to be taken back. The repatriation process is going to be a very long, ongoing process, not just a one-day event.
Whether they are returned to their land of origin or not, the Benin bronzes are an enduring reminder of the dark and dangerous lengths humans will go to in order to possess things of rarity and beauty. Next, our journey takes us to late 19th century Norway and to the home of Mr. and Mrs. Munch, whose son Edvard would one day paint a dark and haunting work called The Scream. But our story centers around an earlier painting, one that tells us why Edvard Munch has been described as an artist beset by misfortune.
Perhaps more than any other painter of his time, Edvard Munch had good reason to feel cursed. He was born in 1863 into a Norwegian family that was blighted by poverty, sickness, and madness.
Munch actually had a terrible childhood. When he was only 5 years old, his mother died of tuberculosis.
After her death, his father became almost rabidly religious, which meant that family life was often difficult.
His father had a lot of depression, anxiety, fear about the future, and all this transmitted down to Munch.
Munch and his sisters were brought up mostly by their aunt.
Munch may have thought being under the protective wing of his aunt would mean his family's troubles were over. However, this would prove not to be the case.
Munch's father, a retired army doctor, contributed to this turbid atmosphere. He told Munch lurid ghost stories, claiming that Munch's mother was looking down on him from heaven and watching all the bad things that he, Munch, as a child, did. And throughout his childhood, Munch was himself constantly ill. He spent many winters off school.
In fact, the only member of Munch's family who seemed vital and healthy was his younger brother, Andreas.
And when Munch himself was 14, his elder sister, Sophie, whom he was closest to of the family and who was 15, died of tuberculosis as well. And I think also the experience of witnessing it, he's 14, he's old enough to know what's going on in a way he hadn't been when his mother died. I think that continues to haunt him. And not only that, but he must have felt a kind of, I mean, I think today we'd call it survivor's guilt, because so many of his family succumbed to tuberculosis and he didn't. And there's always that, why me?
His response to the dark hand he'd been dealt was to write his life, essentially, in oil on canvas. He obsessively and cathartically put down in his paintings all the physical and psychological trauma he endured. And the pinnacle of this was a series of 6 paintings he created over a 40-year period, and he called them The Sick Child.
He painted the original Sick Child in 1885 in Oslo, which in those days was actually known as Christiania.
In the painting, we see Munch's sister with her head turned to the right, and she's facing the lady we now believe to be Munch's aunt.
She's looking towards the figure of her aunt, who's holding her hand very tightly and has her head bowed in despair because she's obviously anticipating the death of this child, who looks very frail and pale. And she stares towards the curtain behind her aunt, which has been interpreted as this veil between life and death.
If Munch's painting seems filled with the sadness he felt, it was perhaps a reflection of the company he was keeping. Munch was a dedicated member of the Christiania Bohemians, a group of radical writers and artists based in Oslo.
They believed powerfully in painting and writing that came from the soul. Their motto was, "Thou shalt write thine own life."
Munch certainly seems to have followed that mantra in his paintings, but also in some rare words he wrote about his life. He once recalled how illness, insanity, and death were the black angels that kept watch over my cradle and accompanied me all my life.
The original version of Sick Child is very important indeed, because it provides us with quite an unfiltered viewpoint into an artist's tormented mind.
It feels haunted. There are not many paintings as raw as that in Western art. And the interesting thing about The Sick Child is that it's painted in a style that doesn't actually exist yet, which would later be called Expressionism, which is a highly emotional and emotive style of painting, which Munch is really the pioneer.
He painted it over the course of a year, and he kept scraping it back and then reworking. It's much more about his feelings and his memory of his sister dying in bed. And when you look at it, you can see it's almost got, it has this scumbling and these kind of areas of paint which are dragged down the canvas. It's almost like you're looking at her through a veil of tears even.
Munch decided to exhibit The Sick Child at the annual exhibition in 1886. The painting provoked an immense reaction, but not one the artist might have been anticipating.
It was not the kind of painting they were accustomed to. It was unfinished, they thought. It was rough, it was untidy. How dare he exhibit anything so disrespectful to the name of art? That there was a lot of acrimony and some really unkind commentary about the painting.
It was actually jeered at. People didn't like it at all, and that was rather a surprise when we now think of it as being one of the most important works during Munch's career.
Perhaps the reaction was predictable. At the time Munch created the painting, mental illness was little understood. Those suffering from it were often locked away and treated more like prisoners than patients. But the power the painting had over the artist is beyond dispute. Munch returned to the subject matter of the sick child frequently. He committed his anguish to canvas another 5 times. Before long, another of Munch's sisters fell ill and had to be committed to a mental asylum. Then, in 1895, in another tragic twist, Munch's formerly hale and hearty brother Andreas caught pneumonia and died at the age of 30. Life had been nothing if not cruel to Edvard Munch.
Was Edvard Munch a cursed artist? Well, certainly his entire life was blighted by illness, madness, and tragedy. But he himself appears to have viewed what would otherwise be called a curse as a blessing. He argued that had it not been for the plight he suffered, he would never have been able to create the masterpieces, the apogee of the tortured outpourings of the turmoil in his mind are the 6 extraordinary paintings which form the Sick Child series.
If you find yourself in Norway or London, you won't be far from one of Munch's paintings. But if you gaze upon it, be prepared to shed a tear for the sad soul of a genius. Next, we journey to London and the British Museum. In room 62, there sits the decorative image of an Egyptian woman.
In the long and often colourful history of cursed treasures, ancient artifacts brought back to Britain from all over the world, few can match the trail of death, destruction, misery and ruin of the unlucky mummy of Amun-Ra.
The curse of the unlucky mummy is powerful and far-reaching. It's been blamed for 2 of the most infamous disasters in human history: the sinking of the Titanic and the outbreak of World War I.
The unlucky mummy, in fact, refers not to a mummy, but to what we call a mummy board.
A mummy board is not a sarcophagus, it's not a coffin, it's not even the lid of a coffin. It is a flat, mummy-shaped board decorated to look like a mummy, quite elaborately decorated in some cases, but it was used to place on top of the wrapped mummy, sometimes within another coffin.
As is typical of mummy boards and coffins from the 21st dynasty, so around about 950 BC, the entire surface is decorated.
When visitors to the British Museum look upon the unlucky mummy, many claim it instills a sense of unease and even fear.
She has her eyes open, her arms outstretched, and her palms and her fingers are being shown as though they're reaching out, and it's this depiction of her that makes people feel a little bit eerie, as though there's something malevolent about this woman.
The unlucky mummy board is painted with images from the Book of the Dead, this kind of passport into the afterlife.
The Book of the Dead is a series of texts that Egyptians believed would help them navigate the underworld after death. It has greatly added to our understanding of why they prepared their dead so elaborately for the afterlife.
Because we lack a name of this individual, we can't say for sure who she was, but based on the style of the coffin board, we can tell very likely when she lived, the 21st dynasty, almost 3,000 years ago, and very likely she lived and died in Thebes, the area of modern Luxor.
The best guess is that because of her dress and because of the way she is depicted with hands out like that, is that she was a priestess of the sun god Amun-Ra.
Amun-Ra is the name of one of the principal gods of Egypt, especially during the New Kingdom and onwards. He was the god of the great Karnak temple and a god associated with royalty.
Whoever the unlucky mummy really was, her belief in the afterlife, as with all Egyptians, was absolute. Disturbing her resting place would always be destined to make her spirit rage.
The idea of a mummy's curse, although a lot of people kind of date it back to kind of Tutankhamun, in fact you can find references to it earlier than that, including in kind of fiction and plays and so on. So it was an idea that was around.
Archaeologists are not certain when the unlucky mummy was first discovered. However, it's likely that it was unearthed by locals in Egypt. Along with many such artifacts, they were sold off to Victorian tourists eager to own a piece of an ancient world.
The myth of the unlucky mummy begins with a wealthy amateur archaeologist from Britain called Thomas Murray visiting a local dealer in antiquities in Cairo.
He was one of 5 men from Oxford who were travelling through Egypt at the time.
The dealer showed Murray the mummy board. He was impressed and decided to buy it.
From the moment it was purchased, bad luck befell all of the people that were involved directly with this mummy. So if we first look at the party of 5 men travelling through Egypt, 2 of them died on their way home. One of them managed to shoot himself in the arm accidentally and had his arm amputated. Another one died in poverty sometime later.
By the time he got back to London, Murray had become convinced that the mummy board was cursed, and anxious to palm it off on somebody, he lent it to some of his friends. But the lady to whom he lent it suffered almost immediate misfortune. Her mother fell downstairs fatally with the mummy board in her house, and then the woman's fiancé broke off their engagement. Unsurprisingly, she decided she wanted nothing more to do with the cursed mummy.
We know that the unlucky mummy came into the collections of the British Museum in 1889. There was already a series of stories floating around about it having brought about misfortune or mishaps to the people who had owned it.
It seems even being inside the British Museum did nothing to allay the rumours of a curse.
Very shortly after it arrived there, reports apparently circulated that it was wandering the halls at night, shrieking, making ghastly noises and frightening the staff. And then members of the staff who'd been involved in the transportation of the board to the museum suffered accidents, and some of them died.
Around 1904, a British journalist, W.T. Stead, got hold of the story. As he researched the artefact, he became absolutely convinced that this artefact was cursed. He wrote an article that was published in the Daily Express called The Priestess of Death, and it was really that sparked off the legend of the unlucky mummy. It became known by the wider public. Everyone was talking about this unlucky mummy.
But the ghostly goings-on at the British Museum were nothing compared to the next runaway rumour to grip Edwardian England.
According to the legend, the British Museum wanted to get rid of it. It really achieved its name and was considered to be highly cursed because of all the events that surrounded this artefact. And so the mummy board was sold to a buyer in the United States.
It's said that none other than William Stead himself accompanied the unlucky mummy on the journey to its new owner.
On his journey across the Atlantic, William Stead entertained his dinner companions with prolonged stories about the unlucky mummy and the spooky events surrounding it.
But underneath this fascinating theory lies a chilling truth. William Stead was crossing the Atlantic on the Titanic, and within a matter of hours he would be dead.
The Titanic went down, causing the death of 1,500 men, women and children.
Unfortunately, W.T. Stead was one of the victims.
Some of his mummy board stories were remembered by his dinner companions who survived the sinking of the ship.
It was said that this artifact was on board the Titanic when it sank, and then that it was rescued after the ship had gone down.
So following its alleged arrival in the USA, the mummy board supposedly continued its journey of misfortune. It was then sold to a Canadian buyer, and then it was to make its way back to England upon the RMS Empress. But that ship also sank.
When the unlucky mummy was alleged to have finally arrived back in London, it wasn't just penny dreadful journalists and high society gossips who were caught up in the excitement.
People like Margaret Murray, an early female Egyptologist who was based at Manchester Museum for some time, she even claimed that a German collector had acquired the object and had donated it to the German Kaiser, thereby starting the First World War. Now, she was trying to dismiss the stories as nonsense, but in fact she ended up fueling the curse myth.
But what's the truth behind all these stories?
There are two threads connecting all of this web of stories. The first is the desire of journalists and newspapers to publish ever more sensational stories. And the second is that all of them are pure, unadulterated bunk.
The British Museum assures us that the mummy board has never left its premises the whole time, apart from a few times it needed to be protected during World War I and World War II.
The story of the unlucky mummy of Amen-Ra has literally gone round the world. And not surprisingly, it is completely, utterly untrue.
One thing is certain about Amen-Ra, the unlucky mummy. She will continue to cast a spell upon the imaginations of all those who see her for generations to come. The final leg of our cursed treasure hunt takes us to modern-day Turkey. It was once home to the Lydian Empire, a prosperous civilization known for the quality of their jewelry. But unfortunately for their dead, it would make their resting places irresistible to tomb robbers.
Like all such ancient hoards, the Qur'an treasure is literally priceless. But that hasn't stopped thieves, shady art dealers, even international museums from trying to get a piece of the action. And what's happened to them as a result has fueled a popular belief that in some way the Qur'an treasure is cursed, and that those who seek to profit from it will meet misfortune.
The grave diggers who found the treasure all had terrible, terrible misfortune afterwards.
Suddenly, this man felt like he was cursed, he was choking, he couldn't breathe, and he fainted.
So there's a really dark side to this story. I don't believe in curses, but I do believe in justice.
The Qur'an treasure is a breathtaking collection of 363 pieces of gold and silver jewelry that dates back 2,500 years.
The Qur'an treasure is a collection of artifacts that were looted from a number of different tombs in Turkey.
The Qur'an treasures were found in what is today Uşak province in western Turkey or western Anatolia.
It's quite a fertile region of well-watered valleys separated by mountains.
Locals knew the region had hundreds of tumuli, or ancient burial mounds. Indeed, over the previous centuries, they'd all been looted by successive generations living in the area. Nevertheless, in the spring of 1966, a small group of villagers were out investigating a promising-looking mound.
They knew that the soil that made up this burial mound, this tumulus, was different from the soil that they recognized in their own fields. It had come from somewhere else.
After digging for hours, they found what looked like a marble door, a marble kind of ceiling.
The men set about trying to smash the marble entrance with their tools, but found it too strong to break. Clearly, those who built the tomb had done so fearing this very day would arrive.
They couldn't break through the stone wall. So on the 6th of June, they got some help from a local iron worker and they used dynamite to explode the top of the tomb.
And when the smoke cleared, they found themselves looking down into the burial chamber of a queen from the Lydian kingdom.
The Lydian civilization of Western Turkey grew and reached its flowering period in about the 6th century BC, before it was destroyed by the Persians. They were very famous for their metalwork because they had good access to natural gold mines.
They may have been actually the earliest discoverers of coinage, first to use coinage, along with the Greeks perhaps. And they were a major, very rich, wouldn't call them an empire, kingdom, certainly quite a powerful kingdom in Western Anatolia that was very wealthy.
So when the men first entered the tomb and there was a man lowered down very carefully by a rope into the burial chamber, the first thing he saw was a very well-preserved female body lying on a marble slab in the center of the tomb. Immediately, he saw that body sort of evaporate into dust, and instantly he felt cursed. He couldn't breathe, he was choking, and he actually fainted, and they pulled him back up with the rope.
Were the spirits watching over the royal tomb, protecting their queen from anyone who would dare disturb her slumber?
Now, this is actually a real phenomenon that happens in sealed tombs. They can become filled with radon gas. And when that gas is exposed to the oxygen, it causes the immediate evaporation of any organic remains that have been preserved.
Radon is a naturally occurring gas. Over the millennia, it had seeped from the rock into the void of the burial chamber. This deadly gas comes with a curse all of its own. It's radioactive. And when human beings are exposed to it in significant quantities, it can prove to be fatal.
What surrounded the queen was this collection of extraordinary, exquisite jewellery.
But what's also interesting is there are a number of wine jugs, ladles for the serving of wine, bowls for the drinking of wine, gold, silver, gold jewellery, silver vessels.
Perhaps most famous items in the treasure is a brooch of a winged seahorse, and it's made of gold.
The villagers couldn't believe their luck, and they grabbed the treasure and they sold it to a local art dealer. And they got between them the equivalent in today's money of $40,000.
The treasure was smuggled out of Turkey. It went to Amsterdam and it was sold between different buyers.
And then it ended up with antiquities dealers in New York. From there, it was purchased by the Metropolitan Museum.
And the price it paid was $1.2 million. Now that's the equivalent of $10 million today.
Back in Turkey, in villages close to where the treasure had been looted, rumors were spreading about the fate of the grave robbers.
The first 3 people who entered the tomb subsequently experienced very bad luck and misfortune in their lives.
One of them had 3 sons. All those sons died horrible deaths. One had his neck slit in a dispute. 2 of his sons died in car accidents.
The second person who entered the tomb, he went through a bitter divorce, and then he also died soon later.
The cause of death was an aggressive cancer. It seemed that the very act of breathing the air of the tomb had sealed his fate.
And the third man basically went mad and kept on telling people there's barrels of gold buried outside somewhere near where the treasures were originally found, but nothing was ever found, of course.
One man who was involved in the smuggling of the artifacts and selling the pieces on, he used the money to buy a tractor, and the tractor actually overturned and he became crushed underneath it and died. So there are many people along the way, along the journey of the movements of the artifacts, that have come to suffer misfortune.
What of the Karun treasure itself? Did the trail of malevolence follow it across the Atlantic to plague those who handled or saw it?
The Metropolitan Museum had purchased the items, and there it lied effectively in storage for some number of years.
Some already thought that the Metropolitan Museum had bought the Karun treasures knowing that they were stolen from Turkey. Why else would they spend a fortune only to store it for decades?
Eventually, the Metropolitan Museum puts them on display in the 1980s. At that time, they were called the Lydian Hoard. They were actually referenced as Greek items rather than from Western Turkey or Anatolia. So the Metropolitan Museum was actually trying to, in a way, hide it from the public, where the true origin of these items.
Whatever the truth was, the curse of the Karun treasures was far from over.
And there's a Turkish man who had come to New York and had actually seen them displayed, but the Turkish man had discovered that they're likely to come from Lydia. And he had informed the Turkish government, which then opened proceedings against the Metropolitan Museum.
A formal demand for return was made by Turkey in 1986, which was rejected by the Metropolitan Museum. But in 1993, after years of costly legal wrangling, the museum eventually agreed to settle the dispute and return the hoard to Turkey.
The association with artifacts which had been stolen damaged the museum's reputation.
And so the Karun treasure was returned home and given to the museum closest to where it was discovered. Yet the curse was to befall another, and this time the victims once again seemed powerless to resist the lure of the treasure, an untold promise of riches.
In May 2006, the Karun treasure made headlines once again when it was discovered that one of the precious items, which was a golden seahorse brooch, was found to be fake.
A full-scale inquiry led to the arrest of the curator of the museum, the man who had been entrusted with this when the treasure had returned to Turkey.
He was responsible for stealing the original and selling it to pay off a gambling debt that he had. And he was given 13 years in jail for doing this. Now, Kazim actually blamed his actions on the curse of the Lydian hoard, or the Karun treasure, in what he described as gold fever, that this brooch was irresistible. It was almost calling out to him. He couldn't resist taking it and making money from it and selling it and so on.
Those who are motivated by greed and who exploit their finds of hidden treasure, of ancient artifacts, often come to a bad end.
Buyers beware. The centerpiece of the Karun treasure is still out there, somewhere. So, if you spy a brooch in the shape of a seahorse at your local antique shop, think very carefully before you purchase it.